and it looks like we are recording. Hey, hello, welcome to today's painting lesson. Together, we are going to endeavor into a warm, serene summer piece with a really relaxed atmosphere filled with beautiful green hues. And of course, as per usual, it will be in real time. That said, let me tell you about some exciting resources up over on the Patreon page, which will help make the drawing and painting process a lot easier. As a patron, you will get access to the traceables for these lessons, which will make it so you don't have to worry about getting your proportions or perspective right by yourself. Additionally, you can find my ebooks covering composition, color palettes, glazing, brushes, as well as just about everything you need to know about acrylic painting. Also, there are over 100 bonus lessons up over on Patreon that you can't find here on YouTube. And you can also get personalized art critiques from me, so you can get feedback on your work while continuing to improve your techniques. There are a lot of great resources up there. I do recommend checking it out. And with that, now we are going to jump into the lesson. It is a long one, it is a fulfilling one, and I think there are a lot of great little lessons within it. So let's relax, enjoy, and stay creative together. We are going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we'll dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water. This will just help keep our paint wet for a bit longer. With that, we're going to head to our palette and start in the background here. I'll do so by initially grabbing about an equal mixture of our green gold and sap green. From there, because we're in the distance, we want to desaturate it. Typically, we want our more saturated pigments in the foreground. So we'll add in some titanium white and Mars black. And what we're looking for here is essentially a mid-gray or mid-green gray. Something that isn't too saturated, can be brightened, and can be darkened. So I'll start by applying this mixture in the back, and I can already tell, you know what, I want it to be a bit more gray-green than it currently is. So we'll just double down on that. It's an important lesson that we don't always go for the first color we mix. That's so much better. And our paintings will be so much better for it. All right? With that, I'm essentially working around a lot of the foliage that I have in the midground. The larger flat-headed brush is great for that because it has that nice sharp edge, which lets me cut around so much of this drawing, but it's also quite large, so I can apply a lot of paint at once. Now here you can see there's a little bit of another drawing. I'm just going to make that area slightly brighter because it's essentially the head of foliage. It protrudes, it's going to catch more light. I don't want it to be much brighter, but we'll just make it a little bit more so. And then we'll go back to the regular pigment for working around it. And right now, everything's going to look very flat. We're not adding in any detail or texture. We're just getting that base layer in, which we can build highlights and shadows on top of. We can also leave brush strokes in here because they're going to add nice texture later on. Now here we have foliage. I'm just going to randomly tap in some spots, that way we can have openings within it. And again, I'll just brighten up this area a little bit. You can tell it's extremely minute. It's just so we can visually remind ourselves later where it is. Now from there we want to incorporate some shadows, so we'll make it a little bit darker by interjecting some extra Mars black. And at this point my mix is starting to dry on the palette, so I'll also work in the other pigments, but I'll keep a little bit of it off to the side so that I can remind myself of the value and hue that it is, so that I can make it darker appropriately, right? Just makes it a little bit easier if we leave past pigments on the palette in some small part, simply for reference's sake. So we'll just go with something a little bit darker. I think that should work. If not, we can always remix. And I'll switch to my fan brush here, this stiff bristled fan brush,
So when I add paint to both sides, the bristles should stay separated to a point. And then via rotated taps, as you can see, I'm just interjecting some texture, some shadow. These are essentially the inset pieces in our foliage that aren't receiving light. And because it's detail oriented, I will get you closer. So here we are, a little bit closer. Again, grabbing paint with both sides of my brush. I'll go in for that tap effect. I'm not tapping the entirety of the brush into the canvas. Typically, I'm just picking about a third of it. I'll do these taps. I'm rotating in the air, not on the canvas. We do so in the air because if we do so on the canvas, we just create a larger application than what we want. It's not tight, it's not spaced out, it's not textured in various ways. It's just not the look. So here, we rotate in the air. We get that nice buildup of texture. We have all of the individual little markings present throughout our subject. I also try to rotate it a lot so that I don't get a series of lines, though you can make your subject slightly directional through consistently applying in a similar formation. That's more up to you though. So far so good. It's very clean. Let's make it slightly different by just adding in a hint more Mars Black. Not much. This is going to be for the truly dark areas. And those are going to be dictated by the subjects themselves, but in this case we have this larger area down here, which is essentially the bottom of a tree, the bottom of a bush, and therefore the light is going to wrap itself down or around and it's slowly going to dissipate as we get towards the bottom. So I want that bottom to be darker because the less light can get to it. Typically with patterns like this, the bottom of these taps should get a little bit darker, and then we're going to have a highlight, at least a small one, through here. So that means the bottom of this space is actually here with this opening right in the middle. And that's where our drawing was before. It was right through here, right? So the line, highlight, slowly gets darker. Above that line, darker, slowly gets brighter. And if you just think about it in context with how the light's coming down, it should all make sense. That said, we do need to add highlight next, and for that we need this to dry. So I'm going to clean my brush thoroughly so that it doesn't dry with paint on it, but then I'm going to dry it thoroughly because when this brush is wet, the bristles condense and they make larger applications, which we don't really want to a great extent through here. We will later, but dry it, and from there we'll proceed. Now that everything's dry with our brushes and canvas, we can make a brighter variant of what we were just working with. So yet again, equal mixture of our greens, titanium white, Mars black. However, this time we are aiming for something that's essentially brighter than that which we've used before. So it doesn't need to be a lot brighter, and we don't want it to be a lot brighter because we want other highlights in the painting to stand out to a greater degree. We also don't want it to be too saturated. And I think this would be a good place to start. So we'll grab some pigment, and initially I'm actually going to craft that line that we drew essentially with taps. Definitely needs to be brighter. I'll move you in closer for it though. So right now, as you can see, because it's not bright enough, it just kind of gets lost in there, which we don't want. So I'll interject some extra titanium white, which will desaturate it further, maybe a little bit more than we want. So we'll re-interject said saturation with both of our greens. It's not too saturated, it's not too bright, and I think it's worth a try. So we'll grab that, yet again. Oh, perfect. We'll go and start to define that edge. And here we essentially have little pieces of foliage that stick up and out. that protrude and catch that light, right? So we'll do a good job of defining that top area. And then as we run out of paint, we'll let it come down, skipping little spots and portions to create openings where those shadows can be shown. And we don't want it to be too dramatic. So we'll go over it a couple of times and we'll just slowly create that variance. There we go. Now we'll grab that same pigment and we can work some other branches and protruding pieces up here. I'm going to do them a bit more spaced out and intentional, so it'll essentially look like the protruding pieces of branches that find their way into the light outside of the shadow of the ones that are directly above them. And just like that, I am out of fresh paint. So this is dry. We'll remix more. We'll keep clean pigment on the side, that way we know what we're mixing to. You can see that I made that far too dark. What do we do when we make it far too dark? We adjust by making it brighter. What does making it brighter do? It adds a lot of titanium white, which desaturates it, so it's very gray. Let's brighten again, or resaturate and brighten. We're close. A little bit more titanium white. Also doesn't have to be a perfect mix, as the foliage will change in color from tree to tree with the different amounts of light, but we do want it close. So here, as you can see, a lot of that was rotated in application. Here, there are rotations, but they're not as many, and for the most part, it's horizontal markings with dips that kind of go up and down. They cluster in the central areas of the tree. And we don't really have defined trees here. We're just essentially making it up as we go. It's not a bad thing. This is very much in the distance though. It's the farthest thing in the painting from us. So creating it to be a bit more subtle visually is good. We don't want a lot of really dark hues. We don't want a lot of really bright ones. All of our values are just kind of middle of the road, despite the fact that we have contrast. Okay, now let's just create slightly more diversity, making it slightly brighter. Not by much. And we'll just throw that onto the tops of some of these protruding pieces. There we go. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with that. Next, we're heading back to this brush and we're creating the base for the midground. This is going to be brighter, it's going to be more saturated. So we'll also use a bit more green gold because it's a bit of a warmer green. It's a bit brighter. It'll feel more lifted. But we also can't go with the absolute brightest pigment because we need to leave room for highlights. So Mars Black is still a big part of it. There we go. Good middle ground. And with this, you know what? I think we go even brighter. Remember, we don't commit to the first pigment we select. And if you're up over on Patreon, you can just download the reference photo, print it off, and then color match directly on that if you want the perfect color. I'm okay with this. because I've been color matching for a really long time. But if it's something you would like to do, it is quite useful. If color matching is just something you feel like you need extra help with. Also, you can see that there's a lot of drawing in this. You can also get the traceable up over on Patreon, so you can just copy it line for line, make it really easy for yourself. It's always the goal, just to make painting more accessible, fun. Make sure you're successful with your endeavors in it, right? So, we're going to continue building this out, working in between these trees. Again, I love this brush because you can get these really sharp applications, but you can also add a lot of paint to the canvas quickly, which is useful because it means we're not worried about the last part drying before we get to the next, because we can just move quickly and be agile with it. And we'll just work our way through here. A little bit more towards the back. This area is also going to be that highlighted pigment, but I'm going to go a little bit brighter, similar to what we did here, because I do want there to be a separation between two areas in the middle ground. And this is just the easiest way of noting that. Now we can go back to something a little bit darker, and it can be darker than the rest because it's farther down to the ground. But we still don't want it to be actually dark, because we need to add in our shadows. There's a brand new layer. Now we'll refine all of this later when we get into the water and the reflections, but we're not there yet. And you can see that I'm just softly blending this slightly darker hue into the slightly brighter hue, and I'm doing that through taps and brush strokes, not trying to make it look too clean, because that texture is, again, something great to have showing through. That said, I'm not quite done with this. We are also going to do some of it over here, in between these trees. It's essentially going to be the foliage that we had through here, but I want to do a lot of it with a smaller brush. So I'll just cover the white of the canvas that's left, and then we'll define the actual shapes a little bit later. You can also go back and do multiple layers just to make sure that it's nice and thick, but you want to wait until it's somewhat dry before you jump back and do that, so you're not just ripping paint off the canvas. All right? There we go. Now, at this point, it looks quite messy, but it's meant to. So don't get discouraged when you have a somewhat finished area and then a lot of just plain, unbalanced, untextured, unblended grain. With that, we're going to make something a little bit darker, because now we need to establish the shadows. So we'll interject some Mars Black into our mixture. Remember, we are working predominantly with the gold green, not so much the sap green. Add extra titanium white. We do need to mix a bit of this. And we want it to have a wider splatter, wider surface area on our palette. There we go. That way we can pick it up easily with our fan brush. Now, much like the background, we go in with our taps. However, now I'm not just tapping it randomly. I am to a point, but I'm trying to be cognizant and aware of the general movements of the protruding foliage. So here it moves out that way. So I'm applying it predominantly with a horizontal set of taps, where something like this is more rounded. So I will move my brush to create those rounded applications. That said, again, this is much more detail work than it is broad strokes. So as soon as I'm done with this, we'll get you a little bit closer. So, closer, following those pre-established rules. Taps for rounded scenarios, taps for horizontal scenarios. I'm not afraid to go over the tree branches at all, as we'll just paint those. We essentially just need to know where they are, right? And we're definitely leaving enough of them to do so. Trying to leave a good amount of open space with a lot of these taps. As we get towards the bottom, they'll get a bit more condensed because there will be more shadows in general. You can see that because we made the bottom darker anyway, these get lost in there a little bit, which isn't a bad thing. Okay, so now we're just heading over here, doing a little more of the same. You'll notice that we get quicker with the process the more we do it, because we just establish comfort with the technique, the setting, the mixes, and it just starts to feel very natural. That said, once this is applied, yet again, we wait for it to dry. I'm going to make sure that I do get this little area here too. We'll wait for it to dry, and then we'll come back into it with our highlights. Now, from here, we can start making it look like actually something. And we'll do so by mixing up our brightest green yet. This will predominantly just be our green gold titanium white in the smallest hint of Mars Black. We want room to brighten it still, but we need it to be brighter and more saturated than anything else we have across this line, right? So I think I'll start with something just like this. I'll create a wider mix for our fan brush, which I do need to grab. From here, again, we'll load up both sides, and we'll start applying highlight. The same way we have before, looking for protruding pieces, areas that stick out and can and will receive extra light. This is far from the brightest pigment we'll use, but it's a necessary transitional pigment. The edging will be the brightest portion for the most part, because it won't have as much foliage on top to create shadow. And then it'll dissipate as we move towards the right. That said, let's get you a little bit closer. And now that we have that base, let's go brighter. Titanium white, green gold. You can see the last pigment right there. This one is definitely taking a step up. We're mixing with it, so we still have a bit of Mars Black in that mix, despite the fact that we didn't have to grab more. The brush also wasn't clean, so it had Mars Black in it. From there, we reapproach those edges. Like so. Find the areas that are inside that protrude to a greater degree as well. And I know that by using this brush, we relinquish a level of control just by virtue of making multiple marks with every application. However, we are going to go back in with a different brush and establish that control, build it out intentionally. But we don't want it to be too intentional because then it doesn't look natural. And that's why we start here. It gives us a lot of markings quickly. It establishes pattern. And again, it just looks natural. So starting on the edges. And when it's a larger cluster like this that protrudes, we want to get essentially the top of that edge, and then it'll dissipate not only back, but down. This is at the top, it can be quite bright. We'll get a little bit farther back as well, just so that we can ensure that it's all progressing naturally as a whole. Typically when we're this close, it can be difficult to get that proper perspective, and we can fine-tune details, but not necessarily connect them to others, and that matters. So, stepping back, we're definitely getting there. However, this area is still without much highlight. So we'll tackle that before we really proceed to add detail or build on that space. And with this, we can see that it protrudes right here. Let that come down naturally. Reload our brush. This is fairly interesting because it is where we had our drawing before. Again, you can redraw it in first with Conte or something, but I feel like I have a good inclination of where it should be and how this foliage should interact with it. Again, it will all just be on the traceable, which is linked in Patreon in the video description. So it's easy to find. Just pulling this back, lesser and lesser as we get towards that edge. There we go. Now, let's get brighter. So the next step should be fairly intuitive. We have this bright pigment, and now right to its side, we have an even brighter variant. I do still need some Mars Black just to balance the saturation. Get the majority of the pigment off of the brush. Flip back over to our fan. Now that we're getting very bright, I'm going to try to be a bit more cautious with my applications. Just because we are getting to, not the final layer, but closer to it. And therefore, these markings aren't going to have a lot covering them in the way that all of our past markings have. So these are a bit more committal. I'm still just using about a third of my brush for a lot of these taps. Trying to leave openings that are darker. Remember that we have these areas that do protrude. And I'm trying to be mindful of them. Should lessen as we get back here. I'm running out of pigment, so that's why I'm doing it now. I'm just not getting as an opaque a marking. But you could really see that just 20 minutes ago, this looked really awkward. It did, and that's okay. part of the process. We're making it work because we're sticking with it. We're giving it a real effort. Beautiful. I can tell that paint is starting to dry on my fan brush, and I don't like to wash it because then of course it does condense the bristles, but I think we're essentially just at a point where I have to. So I'm going to wash my brush just with water, clean it well, and then we'll come back in and continue to add highlight, because this could definitely be brighter, but in addition to that, we still haven't touched the side. Okay, so in that period, while my brush is now clean, this is essentially dry. So more titanium white, hint of Mars black, taking the excess off over there, a little bit of our green gold, not touching the sap green. Get a good wide mix. Head back to our now cleaned and dried fan brush because we don't want our bristles sticking together. And then we can just begin applying the markings over here. I think this is a little bit more titanium white heavy than what we had before though. Need slightly more green gold in the mix. There we go. Certainly more saturated. Being very purposeful, especially through here. Very intentional with my mark making, despite the fact that it's still creating a bit of a splattered effect rendering. Trying to hold my brush farther back so you can see the marks being made, but also because when you hold your brush farther back, you relinquish some level of control, which I know sounds counterintuitive right now, but make sure we don't just do everything the same way every stroke or every tap. We're not actually making strokes right now. And it just eliminates that visual sameness that can kind of create a cartoony effect if you're not careful or cognizant of it. So that's what we're just trying to be aware of right now. I'm going to add extra highlights to the tops of these. There we go. Now, back over here, extra titanium white, extra green gold, not mixing the Mars black into it this time. And we'll start with this, but we will switch our brush very soon. You can see how we're just continuously building on these highlights. It's not just one layer, it's not two, it's not three, it's not four. It's however many it takes to create these transitions of value through patterned application. And of course we get all of this beautiful texture in between. Oh, I'm not sure if you can hear that. That's my stomach. If you're anything like me, when you start painting, it's really difficult to stop. And all of a sudden, not only do you miss lunch, you also start to miss dinner. It's just a sign that you love what you do, though, right? That said, I talk about this in a lot of lessons because I think it's important, and it's something that not a lot of people talk about or not a lot of people think about. But when you're hungry, typically we get a little shaky, right? We get less patient. And because of that, our mark making gets a little sloppy. It's not as concise as we want it to be. So, make sure that you do take the occasional break to have a little bit to eat, drink, stay hydrated and healthy through the process. It's wonderful to paint and to paint for hours, as we all tend to do, but we need to be responsible. That way we can continue to paint happily for said hours. That said, I'm going to put that brush down for a second. And we still have a little bit of paint left on the palette. I'm going to try to use as much as I can before my stomach tells me that it really is time to stop. And I'm going to switch to my liner brush. When made damp, it's nice and sharp, very concise, great for detail work. And then we can head in here and create individual markings, which will allow us to create definitive form and essentially add in little protrusions that we may have wanted, but it was too difficult to articulate the application when we were also applying 20 other markings at the same time. And with this, we can build up our edges. We can start working in. We can just paint much more intentionally, right? I'm going to continue to make sure my brush is damp. It will thin the paint, so we might have to do multiple layers. Here you can see I'm going back to some of those applications just to thicken them because they are semi-opaque when wet. But then we can also just naturally build on pattern. All of these markings will likely be slightly larger than what we had with the fan brush. Because of the fan brush, we can do individual bristle markings. Individual bristle markings. It's a difficult one to say, at least with Invisalign. But here, we're using a collection of bristles, right? It's not just one. And therefore we have to tap very softly to get a really small marking. But if you want a larger marking for a larger cluster, you just apply more pressure with your brush and with great ease you render a greater, more grand highlight, at least spatially. And this can be a little difficult to stop. Just very enjoyable. This painting tends to be. Love this. Now, we can't neglect this side. So we'll also come in here. And you can see that I'm now holding my brush more like a pencil. In university, often we're taught not to do that. However, when we're working on extremely intentional fine mark making, I think that it's not a bad thing, especially if we're frequently taking steps back to make sure that everything's balanced. The argument against it is that, again, you just get a little bit too focused, your mark making becomes a little bit too rigid, but I think as long as you're consistently cognizant and aware of those potential issues, you can work around them and create great things. And that's what we're doing here, all right? Once I have exactly what I want, I might take those steps back, hold the brush farther back, and paint in more of a traditionally correct way, with the brush just farther away from me, at least the end of it. But for now, I don't see that as a necessity. There we go. Starting to feel full and natural, right? Took a little while, but we're definitely getting there. slightly more. There we go. Now, as we move forward in the painting, we're actually going to move away from the light. We essentially have this opening back here, and it's catching this, but as we move forward, there's more of the overhanging foliage, and this just doesn't appear in that same way. That said, we are going to get more saturated as we get closer, as we get darker. So with this, I'm going to start switching back to a bit more of a sap green heavy mix. We'll still use about 1/3 that in our other, more warm green. Grab some titanium white. This is all dry, by the way, so I'm not worried about the blend. Again, we're mixing a mid grayish green, but we want it to be more saturated than our past mid grayish green. And I like this, but I think it works a lot better as a highlight. We don't want it competing with that. So we'll just continue mixing. I think this is actually pretty great with just a hint more. And with this, we're going to work in between a lot of our trees. So it's a little bit of a tap on the outskirts. That way you get those just small protrusions. And for the most part, I'm going to be avoiding all that I can in terms of branches and all of that. Now we will have to go back and refine all of the edges that line the water, because as we paint the water, we will make that a bit more messy. That's okay. It's just part of the process. We could do the water first, but there isn't really a perfect way to layer this that won't require going backwards a little bit. And going backwards often just means giving us a chance to refine in a good way. So you can see how this is darker. You can see that it's more saturated than what we have there. There we go. Again, we want to make sure that our layers are fairly thick. We have a good amount of paint. We can leave brush strokes in. Now, yet again, we'll get a little bit closer for you. Start moving higher up in the canvas. Still have a lot of paint here on the brush, which makes it difficult to make individual intentional markings, but we'll do that later with other brushes. Right now it's more about blocking in, getting a solid base layer, and that's what we're doing. So I'm just working my way around our branches in our drawings, our previously applied greens. And you also notice that I haven't gone back to the palette in quite some time. That is just because the brush is damp and we have a lot of paint there. It just hasn't been a necessary step. The more we spread our paint, the more thin it gets. We'll get a bit more unique with our markings in stages soon to come. But for now, this is quite good. You can see how we have a bit of a vignette effect. Now make it a little bit darker A little bit more saturated. Not to a grand amount, but we're also eliminating the green gold from the mix. There we go. And I'll just blend this down into our past applications. Again, brush strokes are fine. They're just texture and character. Though we do want to make sure that we have good application. So I'll probably do a second layer of all of this. We just cut off part of that branch. I'll just open that space up again by applying a lot of pressure. We can even work this into the more dense areas down towards the bottom. This is still a little bit wet, so it's malleable. And that's just because of the water that was worked in. While we have this pigment, we're also going to grab a little bit. And most of this will have to be redone later on just because of how we layer, but just so we understand where our subjects are, we can paint in a few of these. And there should be, those are logs, we'll do those in a different color. Should just be more layering. Make it nice and thick. Now, from here, as I'm sure you've guessed, we are going to make a darker variant, still doubling down on the sap green, no hint of a green gold. We can go to almost a exclusively Mars Black mix when it comes to using titanium white and Mars Black. We still do want it to have that green hue though, and I think this will be great. So we'll spread it out, switch to the fan brush, get a good amount. Going to start this time in the shadows, the areas that are darkest. And because we've done this so many times, I'm able to work a lot more quickly. So it's a lot of taps, it's a lot of rotations. As we get towards the edge, the pigment dissipates. It gets lesser, which is good. Want to make sure that these markings are nice and sharp. And just like this, we are almost done a fairly large portion. Going to work a bit more directionally along the edge, just to double down on those general shapes, get the majority of the new pigment off in this smaller area, and then we can take the remaining pigment and craft the edge to a better degree. Again, don't worry about getting it on the trunks of your tree either. Not a big deal. We are in the foreground, we will see a lot of detail, so I am doing a lot of applications and layering. Okay, now let's head over to a different side. At this point, we do know what we're doing. It's really nice because I think initially when we start this, it looks so awkward, right? And it's that thought of, oh, what if I can't figure it out? What if it doesn't end up looking great? And so while it should be just a fun, cathartic process, you probably have all of these different less than relaxed ideas racing through your head. But now, on this layer, we can work with that realization that, you know what, this does look really good. You can do it. And because of that, I think this just becomes a lot more freeing, not only in technique, but the mental approach to it as well. And so with that in mind, we'll just start up in this top corner because we want that vignette effect. That's where the majority of the shadow is going to be, as well as along this edge. Then as our pigment dissipates, we'll work inwards, specifically towards the edges, avoiding those lines showing through in later stages. We do that through lots of applications, pressing with intentionally small portions of the brush. Here we can notice quite a few, so I'm just going to cross them. And just like that, they get lost. Now that you're looking for them, they might be slightly more visually prevalent than they would be to a new eye, but I think for the most part we have done a good job of allowing that to sink into the background. There we go. Now I think this is a neat shot, as we can see it completed in all other corners. So this will be a fun one to watch come together, but it's also just fun for comparison's sake. Yeah, and where do we start? We start on the edge, we start in the darkest area, we start in that vignette, or where the shadow is greatest. We let that pigment dissipate as we work towards our edges, where there will be more light, where there will be less shadow. We aren't worried about going over the branches. Also, important update, in the break I did have a little bit of lunch. And now I feel like I can concentrate. My hands don't have a shake to them. By the way, if your hands ever do have a lot of a shake, just naturally, great tip, you can take your pinky finger, put it on a dry area of canvas, and then work from there. It will eliminate a lot of that and make it easier for you. I do it when I work with fine details and more particular brushes. That said, we will need to let this dry. And then we can head in with our highlights. Now, onto our first layer of highlights, which will be done actually quite a bit differently than what we did in the back here. Though we are going to start by looking for that main hue that we had, that main value, right through here. We're going to make a brighter version of it, not a brighter version of that, because they are different. We are sticking with just the sap green. We want it to be a bit more saturated than it currently is. You can tell that it does need to be darker, despite the fact that it doesn't need to be worlds darker, it does need to be darker. So we'll just continue mixing a good amount of it. Make it a bit brighter. A little bit brighter. And I think that's likely a great start. So, we'll put that down, and now, rather than using our fan brush while dry, I'm going to dip the bottom of it in some water and wipe off the excess. This is going to condense our bristles into 5 or 6 clusters, so we'll make much larger markings, which makes sense because this foliage is a lot closer to us than this was, so the foliage itself will look larger. So from here, we'll grab that pigment and we'll begin applying it as we did before, typically along the edges to begin, as that's where the light will begin to work its way around and through our subject. And then we'll slowly work our way back down. Now there are multiple clusters in here, so we'll start that second one, which protrudes. And this is quite subtle. I think what we'll do is we'll do a little bit over here just to make sure that it's nice and cohesive. And then we'll make a change once we have enough incorporated that it feels natural with the other side. Now, closer, a little bit brighter, not too much. We want to take baby steps here. So we'll still work that Mars black into the mix. Create a nice wide spot on our palette. Make this nice and wet to condense those bristles. And now we'll go in with our new highlight, which isn't really a highlight. You can see that it's still quite a bit darker than that which we have back here. You can see that our markings are larger. I am applying slightly more pressure with my brush to press in and create those larger markings. So we're doing it intentionally through the use of water on this fan brush, and we're doing it intentionally through our actual application style. Also, in regards to this fan brush, it is a stiff bristled fan brush, which is great because it means when we add that paint, typically our bristles do stay separated and we get all of those little markings, but then when we add water, it becomes a lot more like a soft bristled fan brush, and I used to bounce between the two. So if you watched the older lessons pre-2021, I would always switch back and forth between brushes, which meant washing two brushes and keeping track of two and all of that. But this is one that we worked on for quite some time to get exactly right, and I love it for foliage because, as you can see, now we have these larger applications where before we had the smaller ones. I don't have to switch brushes. I just add water, it condenses those bristles, and it's like having a soft and a stiff bristled fan brush all at the same time. It's just so versatile. And if you're interested, and if you want to work with exactly the same tools that I am, you can find my 5-piece cruelty-free brush set in the video description. I've been using the same set of 5 brushes for the last, I want to say, year and a half. So they're holding up really well. I clean them and I take good care of them, but again, if you don't want to kind of guess, oh, what is he using? Is mine similar? You can get the exact same thing, and it was designed so that all of the acrylic lessons on this channel would be done with exactly this brush set, so you wouldn't have to go out and grab brand new brushes for new techniques and all of that. It essentially was designed to work with all of the techniques and just be very versatile. So, link to that in the description, as per usual. But I like how this is coming along. We need to head a bit higher up in our canvas, and we are going to do a lot more with this, but I don't want to do it until we start balancing things. So now heading up here, starting along those edges, starting to work our way in, pressing harder than we were before, creating more pressing and applications, more actual taps towards the edge than I do towards this back area. In fact, it gets more and more sparse. So it's the opposite of how we work with shadows, right? We have more applications of the shadows up here, and they dissipate as we go this way. Here we have more of the highlighted applications towards the edge, and they dissipate as we go that way. We are still going to have some, and they are going to protrude in some areas. Like here, we'll catch some extra highlight, but it'll be more of a randomized interjection than it is a larger intentional application, right? We want to make sure that all of our edges are covered. However, I am going to go back in with a different brush and technique to ensure that later on. So if you're just having a hard time articulating the brush in a specific area, trying to fill it in as you get those edges, recognize that it is okay. We will be going back. Doesn't have to be perfect and everything you want it to be this second. It's a big lesson in these, right? Just patience in general. There we go. Far from perfect, but we're getting there. Now, let's get brighter. As we do. A little bit more green, a little bit more titanium white. Not an exorbitant amount. And if we go a little too bright, then we just add that Mars black. Tone it back down. Because it doesn't have the yellow from the green gold, even if it's brighter, it shouldn't conflict heavily with that which we have here. And by conflict, I mean blend in. Because that's really the thing we need to watch out for, is keeping that separation between this foreground batch of leaves and subjects just need to be different. Still letting it dissipate as we work our way up. Wrist and hand get a bit of a workout through this, to be honest. There we go. See that in comparison with what we have done there? So much more depth. And still, again, not done. Just going to define this area, which can connect with that. You see there's a bit of a V where they cross paths. Ooh, I like that. It's very good. It's not too dramatic anymore. Creating that separation. We will add in grass and other types of foliage as well, but this is our base, this is what we build on, and this is what we have an abundance of, at least initially. Okay, so we're close. I'm going to do just a little bit more in that brighter direction. Not a big change, but there's definitely room for additional depth without making it actually bright. See that? In comparison with all the other areas? We didn't change the pigment much, but we had a big impact on the painting through subtlety. And I love that. That's really typically the goal. Just realized where this cuts off now. There might have been a spot that was not on camera filmed. I apologize. Just kind of got lost in the painting process there. That's still on camera? Yeah, okay, good. Just barely, but we made it. Now we can expand. It really does add a lot of volume. Trying to create little protruding pieces within the top too. And we'll just finish off these areas. Now, before we embark on the details within this, or even the greater highlights, I want to work in the bodies of our trees, because we want to layer a lot of the details from this over top of it, and it'll be a lot easier than trying to paint the trees around all the little details. So we're just going to work intelligently with this, and I'm going to begin with some Mars Black, about an equal mixture of titanium white. It will render a darker gray because the Mars Black is a bit stronger. Then I'm going to grab a little bit of our sap green, and I know a lot of us probably thinking, where is the burnt umber, the burnt sienna? Why are we going in with something that's the same color, or at least utilizing the same colors as everything else? That's because we want something nice and cohesive. We want it to fit the atmosphere and aesthetic of the rest of the piece. And often, tree trunks look a lot more gray than they do brown. It's kind of a misconception that all trees' bark is brown and looks it. So here, I was just looking at the reference photo and noticed that it all felt a lot more of a gray-green. So that's what we are going to implement in here. I do occasionally work over the pre-implemented foliage. That's okay. We do intend to go back and add a lot of it anyway. I am using the larger flat-headed brush because it's allowing us to cut with nice sharp edges, carry a lot of paint. Just very ideal for this type of application. You can probably tell that my applications are also semi-transparent. That's because it is nice and damp. That's helping me get the extra spread with the pigment. It's helping me keep the application sharp. It does mean that I'll have to go back and do extra layering, but we probably wanted to do that anyway, just because it's good to do. There we go. I also don't like to do a lot of hyper elongated strokes when doing this. I like the minor taps with a bit of a drag. That just keeps it feeling much more natural, gives it a better flow. Because we could have something that's very soft looking by a continuous marking like that, where we realistically want little movements and protrusions within the tree. So that's something I'm trying to continuously implement through the breaks and the markings. And we'll work on a lot of smaller branches later. We can do a couple now, but for the most part we'll want to do those with a different brush. So we'll just build out the larger ones that make sense. And then we'll get a little bit closer to our second layer. As we get closer, I think it's quite evident just how thin a lot of these initial applications are. You can really see that background through it. And for the second layer, we do want this to be mostly dry, and we're going to be switching over to our smaller flat-headed brush for added control. Now this was very watery, and I want this next layer to be a bit thicker, so I'm just going to add additional paint to the mix. That way it's more paint than it is water, where in the past it felt pretty equal. So we'll just mix that up, and you can even tell on the palette just how that looks more opaque. Now, when I'm going in for these smaller applications, I'm applying very little pressure, because the more pressure we add, the larger our stroke will get, and I'll show you. I don't normally like to do elongated strokes, but just for teaching's sake, watch this. We're going to start with a little pressure, start to apply more, start to apply more. And you can see how this brush made that small marking, but it also made that large marking with a singular stroke. We didn't need to make multiple, we just applied more pressure with our brush. Now I'm going to go back in and make these applications look a little bit more unique. There we go. I think this is quite stark. We'll definitely need to add highlight to it. Make it three-dimensional, but it's a good start. Here we'll interject a little bits of this tree in and around our foliage. Start cutting down. Continuously going back to grab more paint because the water isn't letting us just continuously apply like with our first layer. So the technique is changing a little bit. I'm going to make this slightly brighter for this one because I want it to look just a bit farther away to have more light on it. Not by much at all. And I want some unique movements, so I'll just use the corner, that sharp end of the brush, to create some protruding, unique elements. There we go. Like that a lot. Grab extra titanium white, sap green, Mars black. We'll make this mix a little bit darker as we move up to the top, because this is getting almost no light. There's a lot of foliage that's blocking said light, or said potential light. Looks a lot different with layer number 2. And it'll look so much better once we make it textured, three-dimensional, have foliage on top of it as well. Everything's still just kind of in those beginning stages right now. Very little pressure for these distant ones. This is cleaning up nicely. Maybe interject a bit of it down here, maybe a bit of it up between the foliage there, just to make it more unique. give us some extra depth within the pre-existing applications. This is really close to us, so it should be darker. It's farther away from the light. We'll still use quite a bit of green so that it has a hue to it. Now you can see this and this have a different contrast. This definitely feels closer because of it. And we are going to do a third layer, partially. You know what, no, we'll do that through the highlight section. Okay, next, we're essentially just going to do a couple little touch-ups. So with this, I want it to continue down there. Want little pieces like that. Again, just touch-ups, not doing anything too different. We'll make a much brighter, more gray version. You can kind of throw these in as you feel they make sense. I think having some duality here would be nice. Let's go much brighter. These are just to the point where you barely notice them. Just a little bit of extra detail in the back. Nothing wild. Again, this is more free-flowing. I'm not even connecting this to the bottom. Just kind of poking out of foliage. There we go. Letting this dry, and then we'll come back with some texture and some detail. Okay, so now that everything's dry, we are going to start making this a bit more three-dimensional. We know that light is coming in from the back for the most part, and maybe in a bit of this direction. So that means our trees that are in the light, like this one, will get light on the left-hand side, and we'll just render a brighter variant of the color that we were using to start this. Still using the medium-sized, or rather the smaller flat-headed brush. Still going to tap this on with a little bit of a drag. And this is quite bright, which is okay. The more transitionary pieces, layers you have, typically the better it'll look, the more natural it'll look. But because mine is so different, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the extra pigment off the brush, and as it starts to dry, I'll just start going in and dragging it back a little bit using the excess pigment. This will build a little bit of texture, it'll create a gradient, and just like that, we have something that's a bit more dimensional. We can take this same pigment, we can work that onto the left-hand side over here as well. And we can even throw it into some of these in the background if they're large enough, but we don't have to. That's just the first step. Now this one, despite being very much in the shadows, we'll still get a little bit of this effect. We'll need more pigment, so we'll go back to mixing. And we'll start with something that is quite a bit darker than the last mix, because it is in a darker spot, and this pigment is darker than what that was. So just like this, here's something a little bit darker, not much. You can see that sometimes I accidentally move my strokes outside of where the initial tree was, widening it. For that reason, I like to typically paint my base layers a little bit smaller than I want them to be in the end, because you really want to make sure that you get that edge. You don't want it to be dark, a little bit brighter, and then dark again. And then here's just a bit more of a highlight, not too much. Then on the edge, through a series of taps. Don't want it to be bright, just brighter than what it was. Then we can do a little tap and drag. We move in as we start to run out of pigment. Nice and easy. Barely noticeable. Let's get you a bit closer for this one. So jumping in, already being a lot closer, you can tell that transition, the strokes. We're doing that just to the right hand side of the painting now. Can dissipate as we get farther down to the bottom because we'll just have more shadow, less light. And we can go back and just rebuild here, add extra detail or texture should we want to. Occasional little splash highlight in the back. You can see that I'm really jumping around. Then, let's get a little bit higher. Now we have this large branch towards the top. I'll use that same mixture that I was using down there because it's very dark. And I'm going to apply this to the bottom because the top definitely isn't getting any light. It's far too covered in foliage, and the light that's coming down is coming, it's reflecting off the water, it's coming back, it's hitting the tree, it's reflecting off the leaves, it's very atmospheric. It's not strong, it's not direct, so it's not going to be dramatic. We just want a little bit of texture, a little bit of movement and rhythm. We want to create it so that it's cohesive within the rest of the piece, and that's just fairly easily done through this process. Now we'll grab a hint more titanium white, go at it again. Now I know this looks a little bit bright, don't worry, it's very watery, it'll dry darker. You'll probably get to watch that happen as I apply it. I'm not going to go over the same area too many times though, because we don't want to accidentally build up that light, that brighter area. Not dramatically anyway. If you accidentally make an area too bright, that's okay though, because we can just paint over it, or we can add foliage on top of it. One of the beauties of painting trees and branches and all of that, right? Now let's head over to the left-hand side. Okay, so immediately jumping into this, I really like how this is quite dark. This is more of a medium, this is a bit lighter. We have a real transition of light, and that's how it should be. We have that over here, but I think it's just very naturally noticeable through here. And that's how we achieve our depth. With that, let's mix up a bit of a brighter variant. To begin, we're still using our green because we want that cohesive hue. Starting in the middle tree, because you already did a little bit back here on the left-hand side. We'll just do those taps inward. I'm going to do just a hint on the right-hand side as well, not as much, but here we are in a spot where we're going to get a bit more reflective light from the water. So the light's coming in, maybe it'll hit that left-hand side, but then there'll be a little bit of reflected light on the other. So it does need to be slightly brighter, not too much. We'll start at the top where it will get that direct light. Let it dissipate as you move down. Great. A little bit more through here. Gonna incorporate the start of it. And this, you can also darken it a little bit as you move to this tree, but this area was going to essentially be receiving the same type of light, the same amount as this one. So I decided not to overdo it. Or I decided I could overdo it a little bit without real ramifications to the reality of the piece. It still feels natural, it still makes sense. Is it a little bit brighter than it would be in nature? Maybe a hint, but not detrimentally so. And we'll just put slightly more of that highlight through here. Slightly more of that highlight through here. There we go. Brilliant. Love that. So from there, once that's applied and dried, we're going to switch back to the larger flat-headed brush. We'll grab our sap green specifically, Mars black, titanium white. We'll mix up a mid to darker grayish green, just like so. Definitely getting there. Need a bit more saturation. We don't want it to be as green as what we have here, but we want it to be close. Put down that brush, switch over to the fan brush. Haven't used that in a little while. Grab pigment on both sides. Then we can tap on some beautiful small greenery texture, which is essentially moss and whatnot. It'll grow predominantly towards the bases. It'll really start amalgamating visually these trees with their surroundings. We don't need to cover them, and we're going to leave lots of openings, but this definitely has a good place within what we're doing. There we go. Let's fix up the mix to be a bit darker. A little bit of Mars black, don't need much. Head back to the fan brush. Apply that to the darker bases of the tree, where the brighter highlight just didn't make sense. This texture really will do a lot. And of course, we'll do a nice little close-up. I think though we'll make the next application a bit brighter. So we're going back and forth between the two. There we go. Nice and wide. There's little bits of variance within the mix, and that's going to be nice for just creating variance within the actual piece. Now because it's brighter, I want to go a bit higher. Not covering the entirety of the tree. Okay, now that our bases for our trees are worked in, we can go back to the foliage and start applying that detail that we were kind of hungry to do earlier, but knew that it was right to wait. So we'll grab titanium white, a little bit of green gold, mix up a very bright variant of what we have in the background. We'll still use a hint of Mars black. Not much. Being very careful with that. Then we'll switch back to the fan brush, which you probably want to be dry and void of the other pigment. And we'll just build out some of these areas with light. We can work it over these branches, which will make it look nice and three-dimensional. Something we couldn't do earlier because they weren't established. Go back to mix a bit more pigment. Try to make them nice and tiny because they are somewhat far away. Not applying much pressure, not rotating the brush once it hits the canvas. Trying to go over a couple of these applications that work over the tree multiple times to build them up, but we can also do that with a liner brush. There we go. Then, up close, once we've started to establish those new formations of foliage through randomization, we can sharpen and build intentionally, right? So we started with that mass application. It helped us ensure that the new areas didn't look forced or too repetition heavy. And now that we've implemented that, we can solidify ideas and make it all look a lot more professional. Can also hold my brush farther back to still add an element of randomization. You can see that this is brighter than our past applications, so that light is slowly going to dissipate as you move towards the right hand side of the canvas. Trying to get smaller markings in there. Also cleaning up the ones over the branches. Continuously going back for more pigment because I am using a fairly watery mix because I do want it to be nice and sharp. Letting these highlights dissipate as we get towards the bottom because there just will be too much shadow at a certain point to justify the current value of our application. And it looked a little awkward initially because there was so much bright just to the left-hand side, but you can see that as we build it out, it starts to feel a lot more cohesive, a lot more natural. Now that we have some extra foliage, we can do some extra branches with our titanium white, Mars black, working for a medium to slightly dark gray, hint of our sap green yet again. We don't want this to be too dark because it's really in the light. But we can start interjecting, and I need a bit more pigment to water. Added a lot of water to make it nice and thin, so it'd be easy to work with, but maybe slightly too much to the point where I just was getting something very far from opaque. So, taking my pinky finger, grounding it on the canvas, eliminating shake, and now we can work branches throughout, and they'll pop in and out of foliage, right? Sometimes they're getting lost. We're not trying to apply them all on the same trajectory either. Here we'll do some that are essentially horizontal, where this is more vertical, these are more diagonal. And I'm skipping lots of areas in the attempt to make the openings feel real. We also don't need to place them all very far from each other. If there's an opening, there's likely more than one branch within that opening. Exceedingly small markings, but a lot of them. Initially, I was also moving towards the left-hand side to create that idea of leading lines, but you do need some that go the other way as well so that it feels natural. Also, don't love to mix with the smaller liner brush because it's difficult to pick up a lot of paint, but here we're really not using that much paint, so it's okay. We'll also work into some of these larger trees with a darker pigment. All of these little bits help. There we go. Even working it through the darker foliage in the foreground. Now for this next step, I'm going to move you a little bit farther back because we need to look at the painting as a whole and not just detail work. Because we need to balance additional details with all of our darker greenery, which I'm going to start mixing using the larger flat-headed brush. Mars Black, Titanium White, Sap Green. We're in the foreground, so almost no green gold. We can use just a hint though. And we'll do a little test. We're essentially trying to make something that's akin to what we have here in the highlight, so it can be a little bit brighter. And I do mean the highlight of the darker foreground. This is the right color. Not the highlight that is behind it. So once we have that, we'll grab our fan brush and we'll make sure that it's nice and damp. Wipe off the extra paint. That way, you can see that it bunches yet again into a lot of different heads rather than being 50 different markings. Now we'll get 5 or 6 larger ones. And again, I'm going to paint from farther away, so I'm holding the end of the brush. And we will try to have this all lead out naturally in the same way these edges do. It'll make the darker areas in the foreground look a lot less structural and a lot more natural. We'll also paint over a lot of our tree trunks and whatnot, the bodies of our trees. There we go. We'll also need to do so for the bushes down here. And we can clean it all up with the liner brush, like we did with the highlights. This is a great way to get started. Okay, so now that we have that established, getting back closer with the liner brush, we can really instigate some nice details, make it feel natural. We want these to be larger than these were though, so I'm applying more pressure with my brush. And because we already used the fan brush, there isn't too much to do in terms of these additions. I think I want this to be a bit brighter though. So throw in some titanium white because that'll desaturate it. We'll also throw in a little bit of the sap green. Didn't make a big difference. Let's go again. Much better. See that? It's a bit more akin to what we have pre-existing on the edges. There we go. You can see that I'm really jumping around a lot, and intentionally so. Just trying to keep it interesting and not hyper focus on one area to the point where I make it too visually samey. Something we're consistently trying to avoid. Here we have this incredibly dark edge, great area to instigate additional applications. But we don't want to fill it because we need it to remain dark and open for these to stand out in a nice way. So I'm not doing too much, but I am making use of the opportunity. Now we'll continue building that depth, and I know it's a lot of layering, by creating an even brighter version with a bit more sap green, a bit more saturated. As we move closer to us in the painting, remember we can see more of the innate coloring of subjects, there's less of that atmospheric light. So we add in slightly more sap green, more titanium white. I switch back yet again to the fan brush, which I will make wet. That way we don't make too many markings. And we'll start applying yet another highlighted layer. though, notably, it is darker and a lot than what we have there, but it's going to create significantly more depth within the areas in which we place it. Try to make sure that your applications are clean and sharp. I'm applying slightly more pressure with my brush to make them larger. Remember, this is highlight, so we work it in protruding areas and along edges that will receive light for the most part. We will do taps back here to a point, but it's much more scarce. See, it made a huge impact on this one. And even in those settings, towards the bottom of this foliage, and we'll work it up. Know you're far away, but the idea was to, yet again, just show you how we're trying to move around, not particularly stay in a singular place, but I will get you closer for some of these applications. So now the camera's a bit closer. I'm still farther away, still holding the brush at a distance, because I want to see it as a whole. And all of these markings in relation to other markings. I am going over this branch intentionally. You can see that I'm rotating my brush in the air. Grabbing more pigment. Really helps make these areas pop, right? Gives them that extra level. Once that's dry, we will yet again brighten and resaturate. So we're just bumping it up little by little. Oh, that's a beautiful color. And because it doesn't have any green gold in it, it doesn't really conflict with the real highlights that we have in the slight distance. It will just be a great pop in the areas that we want extra light to be received in. Like down there. And I think this is where we don't have the final layer of highlight, but we have the final layer of highlight that's applied through this technique. At this point, probably quite good at this technique. Say we've been doing it a lot in this lesson, but it's a favorite. It's in a lot of lessons. It's relaxing, it's cathartic. It still requires thought and intention, but a lot of it can be kind of done in the background of our head, if that makes sense. It becomes very intuitive after a certain point. Once you understand the lighting of the piece, how much you want your gradients to have an impact, and we're definitely there. There we go. That's the edge for this that I've been wanting. Perfect. It's quite watery, so it'll dry a bit darker than it currently is, but that's okay because we can always go back in and add more to the highlights should we want to. And now, we're not going to do a lot of it, but more titanium white, more sap green. We have the initial mix right there, so we're looking to bump that up. It's more saturated, it's brighter, not by a lot, but by enough. Switching to the liner brush for intentional markings. And again, we won't do a lot of this, but there are places where it will make sense, and the painting will be aided by just a slightly greater highlight. Do be careful with it though, because I think we're at a place where it looks great. And we can always walk it back. It is acrylic, it is very forgiving, but start with a less is more approach, and then build as you see fit. Don't think we'll do too much up here. Just maybe the areas that kind of line the edges, and then a couple tap ins so that it feels natural for protruding pieces. Apologies if my brush is a little off camera there, we'll come back in. There we go. That is so much volume now. Great. Now that we've added quite a bit of detail up here, we're going to start embarking on the very large bit of negative space still within the piece. I do still want additional highlights, branches, a lot towards the top, but I don't want to do this until we start this, just for balancing purposes. That said, we're back to the 1 inch larger flat-headed brush, and we're going to essentially mirror the hues and values that we see in the top, but apply them very differently. So we'll start in the background, and that means a very desaturated gray, a little bit on the darker end, so more Mars black in our mix. Typically reflections are slightly darker than that of their actual subject, so we can go a little bit darker than what we were working with. We can do little tests by actually painting directly where we were, and I love this mixture. So we'll put that down for now. Switch over to our filbert brush. This is the one with the nice rounded edges, great for blending, and it can still pick up a good amount of paint, so I'll just make that nice and damp, grab some of our new pigment, and I'm going to cut across that backing edge. It's like the horizon line first. And then I'm going to apply it via vertical strokes downwards. Now we will have to do multiple layers. We will be painting extra foliage on top of it. But as soon as we get to here-ish, things are going to change a little bit. So I'm just going to note that we need to continue it down here. But through here, we start getting the reflection of this. So we'll switch to green gold, titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, a little bit of sap green, not much. We want more green gold in here than we do sap green. And it does need to be a bit darker, because the reflection is often darker. Yet again, a little bit more. Might be a lot. Trial and error is important. We don't just go with first color we mix. Something you hear me say a lot. You know what? Upon reflection, I think we're actually going to apply the first layer with the larger flat-headed brush just because it's so large and I do want to do some blending in the process. But let's remix, now that we have a larger brush, more paint. We'll use our greens, a little bit of Mars Black. Remember, it's just layer 1, so we can edit it, see how we feel. So we'll start placing that right here. And then it comes again towards the bottom. We're looking for those protruding pieces, just like that. We'll roughly cut in here, recognizing we'll fix it up a little bit later. And again, first layer, we'll do a bit messy with this big brush. Just try to figure out where all of our reflections are going to lie. So that's for that. Then this will protrude a little bit more. And the bottom part is for the top of the tree. But it doesn't just end there. It also goes back into the distance, right? Towards the right-hand side. Fits in between a couple of trees as well. And we have a hint of it on the other side, too. Normally I don't scrape my brush into the canvas, but I don't mind doing so here just because it is a very rough first layer. And we can even do a little bit of a blend of this up into that darker area. That said, we also need more of a true green mix. A little bit darker, still a bit saturated. Love that. We just need to make sure that it's not the most saturated pigment. So even if you land on something that you love and adore, if it doesn't fit with the rest of the painting, probably shouldn't be using it. So we'll give this a try. So far I like it a lot. We go to here. And then because of that foliage, it will essentially find its way up. As I move into the previous application, I'm just doing a soft blend. Doesn't have to be perfect, won't be perfect. Reincorporate my drawing a little bit later, leaving open the areas for the tree trunk reflections and the logs that are going to be actually in the water. Now, because we have these darker values up towards the top, we're going to want to reintegrate them towards the bottom of the reflection, so we just add a bit more Mars Black into the mix. And have that work its way into the middle. We can also use this, make it a bit more of a gray version. A little bit darker, a little bit darker, perfect. And use that as the reflections for the larger trees. Just let it softly fade up into the top. And we can also use this pigment, maybe make it a little bit darker to reflect the bottom of the plants that just aren't getting any light. You can see just how rough all of it is at this point. That's okay. Getting that tree. It's towards the edge. We have that little break-off point. It's darker underneath the actual bushes. Sometimes you'll see me cut across with horizontal markings just to get a straight-ish edge, but then I do go back to vertical, and once we're past this little bottom area, remember we get more into the sap green mixes. Blend that both up and down. Quite different than applying it on the top. Entirely new techniques for it. That's okay. We will have more of the green gold down here towards the real bottom. And while we have this on our brush, on our palette, might as well make use of it over here and just do a bit more. Going to go back to the darker mix for this. Has a little curve to it. There we go. Use that dark pigment underneath here. Now we do need to go back and remix a bit of that pigment because we need to carry it forward down in the painting. Make it slightly darker. Reapply up here. And then we did make that little visual note that it did need to continue. Now with this, you see that I'm working it into our other applications, but eventually, just because of perspective, we're not going to see this go up endlessly. We'll start to see the sky. Because we don't actually have a mirror of this, it's a slightly different perspective, right? So, once we just do a little bit more here. We'll go brighter. We'll go more into the green gold, which is more akin to that pigment. Again, apologies if my hand is getting in the way through this portion. It's just one of those things that I'm trying to do somewhat quickly. So I get slight blends. They don't have to be great blends, but I just want a little bit. And it's a lot easier to do if I work quickly. I mean, sometimes not being able to be as cognizant as I want to be with my hands, right? And we did want more of that green gold mix right through here because it's showing through the trees above. So, it's very messy, as it should be, at this point. We'll go back to more of that green. We'll start doing our second layer. We get to clean it up a little bit. Do a little test, aiming for the middle to slightly darker version of what we have as a whole here. following this line, following that edge. Some more of it here. I'll repaint in the actual tree reflections in a little bit. Right now I'm just trying to build up this green in a cohesive way, and that I think is starting to look okay. I like where we're headed. A little bit more Mars Black in the mix for the bottom. And just softly blend that down. Applying very little pressure with my brush. When you apply a lot of pressure, you create strokes and streaks. When you apply very little pressure, you don't do much of that. And now we'll go back to the more green heavy variant of it. Needs to be a bit more saturated. There we go. Just get those nice soft blends. If you have vertical stroke showing, that's actually quite nice. I'm aiming to have a little bit of it, just not a lot. You can see the difference between these two sides that we're starting to create. Now darker, sap green, into titanium white. And that tree will start right about here. If you're using the traceable, you can just recopy that. Make it really easy on yourself. If I get stuck at any point, I'll just look at the traceable myself. Then this one here. And just let it get lost as it blends up. Get lost as it blends down. I'm not looking for a crystal clear glass reflection through a lot of this. There's a bit more movement in the water. It doesn't facilitate that glassy look. And again, a little bit more of that green gold light mixture. You can see I'm doing a lot of this fairly quickly, and that's just to help me with dry time. Here, this tree's about to run out, and we let it do so. Softly just working this up. Love painting reflections like this. It's one of those things that just makes me really happy. Now, this is incredibly thin. I love the color, but it's far too thin. And it's one of those situations where I would love to just leave it because I really like it, but I know that's not the right thing to do. So, here we go, round 2. Make it brighter. Test. Looks good. Right now I'm going to focus on blending it with the left-hand side, not so much the right-hand side, because the left-hand side is wet to a point, the right-hand side is not. So it just makes more sense. But we want this bottom area to be brighter in general, and a little bit more green gold heavy, because at a certain point it could reflect it out of the sky.
Okay. Like that a lot. I think we should probably back up just so you can see a bit more of the top area as we continue the reflection, but we're getting there. Okay, so we're a bit farther back. I have fresh paint on my palette, and we'll now start this color right here, which is a lot of titanium white, a little bit of our sap green, which is already in the mix because I just dragged it from elsewhere on the palette, a little bit of Mars black. We don't want to go with the absolute brightest variant. Let's try this. It's a good start. We can add highlight to it to make it look a lot better a little bit later. Really close to what we had before, actually. So we'll just apply. It's a big tree. We'll drag that down. We'll start our protruding reflections. Now this has started to dry if it's not completely, and because of that, I know that I'm not going to get the most soft transitions ever. That's okay. Because my brush is damp, I'm still going to get a wet into dry blend. This is mirroring that. Little protrusion. And then it can kind of get lost within the general higher highlight of it all. We'll just do a little bit of a blend up into here so that when we apply this, it'll be easier. Thickening all of this. Now we'll go back to our green mix. Sap green, Mars black, titanium white. The top of this is all very bright. This is still wet, so I'm getting that wet into dry blend, which is really nice. We'll do a soft blend up towards the top, just because that is not wet at all. Again, apologies for when my hand is in the way. Haven't caught it on the viewfinder yet, but I'm sure it's happening. Something else we can do, we can grab more of our highlight and blend that up too. Love that, that's a great look. Now we need the darker version of our green to get the bottom shadow portions. Friendly reminder, you don't have to get this all right on your first attempt. It could be your second, third, fourth, 10th. You just keep working at it, and you get better at it every time, and you learn a little bit, and become a stronger painter, and you get better at mixing your paint because you're doing that more. Don't get frustrated. You quit if it doesn't happen the very first time. That's not how we get better at things, right? There. Oh, I love that. That's what we've been working towards. Grew up around a place that was very similar to this. And on the weekends, on Friday nights, I have some friends over and we'd go over to this Really beautiful river just across the street. Be rocks and paths, caves. Really grateful for those experiences. Currently living in the heart of Toronto, which is very much just the big city, at least for Canada here. And I love it. Incredibly happy. And it makes me really grateful that I also got to experience so much nature growing up too. At the same time, right? Doesn't have to be exclusive like that. You can have appreciation for both. Covering this, because I'm going to repaint it. If you struggle with this part, using that filbert brush will make it a lot easier. I feel like I'm just finding the success I want to with a larger flat-headed brush, but the filbert brush would make more sense for that area in particular. In fact, you know what? Let's do that. I know it's correct. I know I should be doing it. I will do it. We need more of that brighter pigment towards the edges. And you can see how, because it's a filbert brush, it's giving me that really soft blend on the edge. I'm really not doing much to add to that. It's just kind of naturally happening, which is wonderful. You can see how we were just able to refine that, give it that really soft look. We can do that over here too. Let's have it coming through the bottom. Add that softness to over here, and here it's not even wet, right? All of this is dry, but I'm still getting that beautiful blend. Oh, I love that. There we go. Still a lot to do, but we're definitely achieving that beautiful glassy look. Just a little bit more here. You can hear my stomach getting mad at me. It's dinner time, around an hour ago. But you know how easy it is to get wrapped up in a good painting session. Let's clean up this bottom portion. Not because we have to right now, but because I just want to. I want to see it cleaner, which is okay. You know, we work in these steps, but we can also take time to adjust. And we'll clean up all of these edges a little bit later on. Okay. Looking good. I think I want to add slightly more paint right here. I was going to say, I'm going to go make food. I'm going to take a little break, as you should when you get hungry. But I'm not going to follow my own advice. I am going to finish the small little area because it's fun. It's far too bright. Hint of Mars Black. Try that. Closer. Oh, actually, I love that. It's brighter by just a little bit. And I can get my soft blends with this brush, despite the fact that it's dry. Ooh. Did not expect to be that happy with it. And then we let that brightness dissipate as we get towards the blended area of the reflection. You can pop just a little bit in here. Oh, I could paint this all day. Kind of want to add maybe a little bit of highlight in there so that I can mirror it there. That's why I said we didn't finish the top yet, because we might want to do things to the top to impact the reflection, because the reflection is half the painting, right? There's a lot to do in the reflection. Every time I step back, I get that reminder of, oh, you really like it, but you have a lot to do, which is exciting because all of it's fun. Okay, this needs to be a little bit darker because it's the bottom, it's the area where there's shadows. So we'll go in with a green gold, titanium white, Mars black, darker. More green gold, should still be pretty saturated. Perfect. Yes, and we can just tap it into the foliage a little bit. Oh, that's so much better. Soft blend down with the filbert using the corner of the brush. Then we can go with the brighter mix again. Blend it, make it nice and soft. Okay, I think it's time to have food. I think it's break time. I'm happy. I'm ready for a break. And then we come back and maybe there's another hour of painting. You'll know that better than I will. You can see the runtime of the video. But this is getting exciting. Now, I took a little break to sketch in some of the logs that we had missing, some areas that I want grass in the background. Did that with Conte because it just comes off with a little bit of water. It's essentially like a colored chalk. But with that, we're going to get back to mixing. And I was going to do it with the larger flat-headed brush, but we don't need that much paint for any of these applications. So I think I'm actually going to stick to the smaller flat-headed brush. Again, nice for precision, but it also does have a decent surface area for picking up and mixing pigment. So I'll start with about an equal mixture of Mars Black and Titanium White, maybe a little bit more Mars Black to Titanium White. Then we'll interject our sap green, because that's what we do when we work on a lot of our branches, especially in the foreground. Bracing my pinky finger on my easel to eliminate shake from my hand. And then I'm going to start on the edges. Of these logs. Try to make them look a bit more disheveled. And then towards the bottom, I'll render a nice sharp line. Now we are going to lift it over here so it comes up out of the water, and then it can kind of come back down, at which point it gets lost. And once we have all of the edging finished, we can just fill that in with our initial base layer, and it'll just be a silhouette at this point, though as I'm sure you've guessed, we will go back in, add texture, detail, moss, grass, all of those good unique additions that make it feel a bit more natural, a bit more real. We're also going to do another one of these over here. Bit sticking up, protruding from the water. Again, going with that nice sharp horizontal line towards the bottom. And then this goes under the water, but then it re-emerges. It gets closer to us. And that's just kind of neat. Right? Different. I don't want these two ending at the same point though. Just because compositionally it's a little awkward. That's repetition we don't want. So I'm going to extend that out farther that way. And I might just bring this one out farther this way. There we go. Now it acts as subject-wise leading. We'll just make a bit more of these pigments. By the way, I know that it doesn't look great yet. We have all these other finished areas, so it by itself is just a little awkward. Maybe I'll try another one over here. Nice and easy. And of course, we have the protruding one to this side. We'll be careful. Put a lot of work into the reflection. So we'll apply this smartly. Definitely want to elaborate on the top of this now. Make it a bit more unique. Add some protrusions. A little less straight. Using the corner of the brush to get those sharp markings. Also, we needed to go back into another layer, so this is good anyway. There we go. Now while we wait for all of those to dry, we're going to head in and put the base layer for some of our grass down. So Mars black, a lot of sap green, more titanium white than Mars black. We want this to be a darker grayish green, but we don't want it to be too dark. And we do want it to be darker than that. Not by much. This is just a base layer. We'll cover it in grass. I think it could be a little bit darker even. Again, not that dark. It's so easy to overdo it with this current palette. There we go. So it's distinctively different from the reflection. And a lot of it kind of mirrors the base of our little patches of land. As we go into the distance, it can get brighter because there's just brightness in the distance. And then there's also, we'll make this one a lot brighter, a little patch of grass almost just sitting out in the water that stretches from one side to the other for the most part. It's almost separating in the river, but not quite. There we go. So again, making everything look a little rough for the time being, but it will pay off shortly. That said, this should have all dried, so we can go back in and add some detail to that. Switching over to the liner brush, grab some titanium white, mix that in with our green, which is since dried. So make it gray, make it green. We want this to be something that can act as a nice highlight on the top. You can see I'm just doing little taps, drags, occasionally missing areas. It's just the light coming down. This is an area, a technique that you could do with a fan brush, but because it's such a small space, and we really don't want that tapping of the fan brush on the reflection, I think it's just safer to take the time and apply these small markings with a liner brush here. Just adding not grand details, but character for sure. This one's getting lost a little bit in the water, that's okay. They all don't have to stand out massively. In fact, if some of them are more subtle, I think it works a lot better. Let's go a little bit brighter. Grabbing more water so we can get a tight application. You can see that's beautiful. There we go. Little bits of light catching the moss and the bark. Doing this through a lot of taps. Most of it isn't strokes, it's taps. But there is that variance between the two. It's not just one. There are going to be areas where this highlight essentially matches what we have in the reflection. You won't be able to see it. It'll kind of erase edges a little bit. That's okay. I'll get you a bit closer though. Alright, so jumping back into it. Grabbing that highlight. Working along the top. Through a lot of these taps. Leaving open areas. Working our way in, especially as the paint dissipates. We can go up here. Add a little bit more of that highlight. Especially towards that open area of light. There is going to be less over here. Because we're getting farther away, I'll let it dissipate as we work towards that edge. And I'll go back to areas that I can tell could use a little bit more, even on the main areas that we've already applied to. Very good. Now let's do a little bit of a reflection for these. Put that brush down. Grab my filbert brush, make sure that it's damp. A little bit of Mars Black, equal amount of titanium white, sap green. Then we'll slowly add in more of our Mars Black. It's not going to be that dark, but it'll be dark enough. It's a little watery. Doing a lot of these markings in vertical strokes after. Let's go a little bit darker. Very good, very good. If it's a little bit too dark or not in the right spot, we can always go back in with the color of the water itself. Be careful using your finger because you don't want to apply oil to the canvas. That might make it harder to work with. But I think that's quite nice. Once it dries, we can go over it with a little bit of this and it'll be really beautiful. That said, there'll be slight amount of movement in the water. So we'll go back to our titanium white, mix up a mid-gray, not too much green in this one. We just want this to be brighter than both of these. And then on that line that separates the water, the branch and the reflection, we'll just craft a nice little line. Here we go. Make it a bit brighter. Small steps that make a big difference. And we can even just throw these in the back, should we want to. Again, taps are also very valuable visually. Get a little bit of a sheen towards that reflection. Now that our grass is all dried to the touch, dried while we did our little reflections and whatnot, we'll start remaking it, and we'll do so by starting with some green gold, titanium white, start with about an equal amount, hint of sap green, not too much but a little bit, and a hint of Mars Black. We want this to be a brighter mixture. We want it to be somewhat saturated. I think that's a good baseline. I'm going to spread it out a lot on my palette because we are yet again returning to our fan brush. And this grass in the background, we'll just do lots of little tap and drags. Tap and drag, tap and drag, tap and drag. And you know what, I think I need to mix a lot more paint, so I am going to switch to this larger brush and I'll get you a lot closer. Yet again, we are jumping back to the larger flat-headed brush, mixing up a lot of this pigment, and I think I'm going to make it slightly more sap green heavy and a little bit brighter. So that's the initial pigment. Aiming for more, aiming for brighter. Still want the green gold to play a real role. Still need some Mars black. There we go. That's beautiful. Just what we're looking for. So, grab that with a fan brush. In the distance, lots of little taps and drags. I'm layering them, so I'm just moving forward little bit by little bit. When we get to the foreground, I'm making my strokes longer. Still layering them. Letting them dissipate as we move towards the left because it's going to get darker. Just using a little bit of the brush for these smaller areas. Doing less and less as we get towards the edge. And then I'll just tap little bits of grass into that far back area. Adding a little bit of an angle to some of the applications. There we go. Now we'll make our mixture brighter. Extra titanium white, maybe a little bit of extra green gold. This should really pop in the background. There we are. Love that. Extra taps towards the outskirts where we'll get that additional light, but not so much back here. Same rule goes for this. There we are. One more time. Extra titanium white. Extra green gold. Nice, bright, and saturated. Okay, now I'm going to clean my fan brush because I don't want that pigment drying on it. And I'll switch over to the liner, grab that current pigment, paint on some larger strokes, using very, very little pressure, because all of these will definitely be larger than that which I was able to achieve with the fan brush, because it is an amalgamation of bristles, not just singular ones touching the canvas. And then I'm going to take this pigment and I'm going to build on the edge of this right here, because that light will wrap around it. It will catch a little bits, and now this will feel cohesive with that grass and that light. It'll also make the transitions down here make a lot of sense. So we'll just do that. We won't go too high with it. We won't go in too far with it. It really is almost like an outline, but we do need to go in a little bit because we don't do outlines in painting, right? We show the change in hue and value over a period of time. There we go. Do the same over here. Just on that outskirts, that edge. Then we can do a little bit of a drawing of the reflected grass in the darker portions of our reflections. Ooh, that's nice. Like that. Maybe, for cohesion's sake, we just add hints of it to this log. Maybe this one too. Maybe it's the moss. Maybe it's a little wet. Maybe it's catching light, therefore it's brighter. There are a couple ways to logically explain why this is as bright as it is. Don't want to do too much though. I say as I do more. Yeah, I'm not doing too much around here. Just little bits. Make a more titanium white heavy mix. It's brighter. Strokes fairly large. Too much water, too much pigment on my brush. Taking both off, grabbing a new amount that's lesser, taking some of it off on the palette. There we go. Really trying to make these strokes minute. Some of which individual to the point where we can mirror them nicely. Now let's grab more of a regular green. Still need some Mars black in that, can't be too bright. There we go. We can just throw some grass onto the floating logs. It'll look really nice against the darker reflections. Don't forget to reflect them though. Any notable pieces anyway? Stepping back, I am getting really happy with it, but, big but, we're not done yet. There's still quite a few things to do, and we're about to tackle them together. Using the larger flat-headed brush, I'm going to mix up a bit of a darker green. So sap green in abundance, little bit of our green gold, more than a little bit of Mars black, but not a grand amount. Hint of titanium white. This is going to be a more Mars black heavy green. We can see it in contrast with the greens that we were just working with. Put that down, pick up the liner brush, make it nice and damp. And then we're going to work in some larger strokes, pieces of grass, whatnot. And we can even do these just floating out in the water here and there. You are very far away for these details, I know that, but the idea here is that we're just adding detail, and I don't want you to hyper focus on it and then do more in a way that doesn't feel like it fits within the rest of the piece. So you know what, I'm actually going to paint really far away, so it's like we are in the same place. You can see I'm holding my brush. This will show up quite nicely over the darker areas. Just little bits of grass that can kind of poke out. Maybe it's because they're on a log or something akin to that. Let's go brighter and continue. I'd also like to say a big thank you to everybody for making it this far. Watching the videos genuinely means a lot that you're this engaged and interested in the lessons, that you're willing to watch for what I'm sure has to be over 2 hours at this point. Love that commitment. I think it's a great sign that you'll make a piece you really care about. Also, big thank you, as per usual, say it in every episode, don't ever want to forget, to everybody up over on Patreon for making these lessons happen. Could not do it without you and your support. This channel is, for the most part, community funded, and you are the community. So thank you, really, truly, for this. Real pleasure to work on this one, and wouldn't have happened if you didn't do what you do. Also, as per usual, if you're new to the channel and this is your first video, you can sign up to Patreon via the link in the video description. Up there, you can get access to the traceable, so the drawing, which you can transfer using tracing paper or freehand sketch it with the grid, or you can use a mini projector. That's something I used to do a lot. But you can also get access to things like the picture for the materials, so you get to use all of the same paints, know exactly what I'm working with. We have a bunch of bonus lessons, over 100 of them, some of which really large on 24 by 36 inch canvas. I'm about to do another one, another big Patreon exclusive series. It'll probably be 10-ish episodes where we work on a very big painting, heavy detail. I'll probably put a poll up this week on Patreon so everybody can vote on what that video is going to be, or that series of 10 videos. And I'll still do videos on YouTube at the same time, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you want to work on something really big, we're about to do that up there. You can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first. In it, we talk about glazing, what brushes to use, how much water to work with, different color palettes, composition, leading lines, all of that good stuff. You can also get a bunch of ebooks full of traceables up there. We have a private Facebook group where everybody shares their work, helps each other out. It's a really positive, supportive community, and you can get access to that through Patreon. And up there are also personal art critiques. So at the higher tier, you can send in your pictures of your paintings, and then I'll make a video that's private and just essentially review them, talk about what's working really well, what we could work on, what we should take and apply to future paintings of yours. But it's a constructive but really positive process. So that's another perk up there. So a lot. Traceables, reference photos, material lists, ebooks, bonus lessons, art critiques, the group. If you're interested, check it out. I'm really proud of kind of the the value we've been able to make that turn into. And I say we because, again, amazing community, which I'm always very proud of. While we're talking about the description, again, you can also get all of the brushes in the video description from my personalized set. It's what I use on all of these lessons, and it's what I've used for all of the lessons for the last year and a half, I want to say, maybe 2. It's been a while. I've moved since then, so it's definitely been a while, but still very happy with them, and you can get them too. We also need to do our code word, right? Something we do in every video. But I think in the last one we didn't do a code word, we did a code question. And the idea is that it's something that only those who get to the end of the video know to note in the comments. On average, only about 13% of people make it to the very end of these videos. So if you are here, you are part of that special 13%, thank you. But with that in mind, one sec, we're going to render a very light gray-green. I'm going to make it very semi-transparent, lots of water. This is in the reference photo. I'm a little hesitant to do it because it's a bold move, but adding little bits of movement into the water. It'll be most opaque in the middle and then become less so towards the edges. And it cuts across different portions of the reflection, kind of noting that it's reflection. I love it. I'm going to soften the edges with my hands. Okay, this is good. This is a good technique. But I think in the comments this week, to note that you got this far subtly, you can be a part of that club. I don't want a code word. I want to know a place that makes you feel sublime, tranquil, just unbelievably relaxed and happy. Because when I was growing up, it was essentially this setting that did it for me. Maybe for you it's the top of a mountain or your bedroom, your studio, a beach somewhere. Feel free to be vague or specific, but regardless, I'd love to hear. I think we're just about done. We can add a little bit of this highlight to separate the logs and the reflections. We don't want to overdo it. And we can do some little taps with it too. Oh, I like that a lot. Definitely do the taps. There we go. These markings should get smaller as you move into the background. But really, truly, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of this community. Thank you for taking the time. If you haven't, subscribe to the channel. And I really I hope you feel inspired. I hope you feel relaxed at the same time. If you've been painting along, I hope you're very happy with your rendition. And remember that it doesn't just look like this from the beginning. There are a lot of awkward stages and steps that we work through, and if you need to repaint something, repaint it. If you need to remix a pigment, remix it. Take that time. Don't just give up if it's not immediately looking amazing, because mine doesn't, and mine never does. And I think the real key to becoming a great painter, really getting realism down, is not just understanding everything from the very beginning and making it look easy. It's about putting in the time, having fun, exploring and learning new things through the process, and adapting with the painting, because the painting always adapts as you learn, and I think it's a beautiful process. So give yourself to that process, learn and grow with it, and I think you'll really love what you end up creating. So that is the painting for today. I will see you next week with a brand new painting. I will see you on Patreon with a poll for the larger painting. And again, up on Patreon, you can also get the trace force and all of that. So I will see you soon. And above all, as always, stay creative.